Love, love, love that song. I'm going to lift this higher so that it's higher than my burgeoning belly so that I can see it a little bit better. Maybe I'll hide it too. So there was an older woman in England after the Second World War during the bombings that had happened in London. And she was standing on the balcony of her home kind of surveying what had happened. And someone said to her, "You don't seem worried. You seemed so calm and peaceful in this really terrible, horrible time." She said, "Well, my pastor told me that I have a choice." She said, "God is up there taking care of my worries. So why should there be two of us that are staying up at night?" I wish that was the case for most of us. But over the next few weeks, we are going to be talking about what it means to be people who are unshaken because we know God. People who are unshaken by the worries and the fears of our lives and the catastrophes that happen in the world because we know God. And to tell you the truth, it's easier said than done. Just don't worry, God will take care of it. But we're reminded in our Old Testament reading today from Psalm 17 that God is always with us, even when our enemies are too close and even when things are falling apart. And you can read along with us on the screens this morning. So, "Hear a just cause, O Lord, attend to my cry. Give ear to my prayer from lips free of deceit. From you let my vindication come. Let your eyes see the right. If you try my heart, if you visit me by night, if you test me, you will find no wickedness in me. My mouth does not transgress. As for what others do, by the word of your lips, I have avoided the ways of the violent. My steps have held fast to your paths. My feet have not slipped. I call upon you, for you will answer me, O God. Incline your ear to me. Hear my words. Wondrously show your steadfast love, O Lord. O Savior of those who seek refuge from their adversaries at your right hand. Guard me as the apple of the eye. Hide me in the shadow of your wings from the wicked who despoil me, my deadly enemies who surround me. They close their hearts to pity. With their mouths they speak arrogantly. They track me down. Now they surround me. They set their eyes to cast me to the ground. They are like lions eager to tear, like a young lion lurking in ambush. As for me, I shall behold your face in righteousness. When I awake, I shall be satisfied, beholding your likeness. This is God's holy word. Thanks be to God. So my grandma, this is my mom's mom, she was a champion warrior. If she could have gotten a prize for anything, it would have been for worrying. Many times when I would talk to her, or we'd stay over to her house, I'd be like, "Grandma, how are you? How did you?" She never woke up before 9, but even when she would wake up at 9, I'd be like, "How'd you sleep last night?" She's like, "Well, I was up at like 2 or 3 in the morning. I was worrying." It's like, "Grandma, you should just go to bed." Anyway. And lots of times we would know what she was worrying about. Part of the reason we would know what she was worrying about was as she and my grandpa got older, but this was their ritual really as long as they were married, the 65 years that they were married, is that they would go to bed every night and they would hold hands and they would talk about the day, which is just so sweet and wonderful. But as they got older, their voices got a little louder. So we could hear what they were talking about. And sometimes they were worried about things that had nothing to do with me, so I didn't really care that much, but maybe I was praying for it already. But sometimes they were worried about me. My grandparents spent most of my 20s thinking I might never get married, so they were very, very worried about that. And I remember asking my grandma, this was probably 5 or 6 years before she died, and she was up all night worrying about something. And I was like, "Grandma, you have the strongest faith in the world. You have this deep relationship with Jesus Christ. Why do you worry so much? Why do you lose so much sleep over worry? She's like, Elizabeth, I trust you. I trust God. I trust God with my whole heart. I don't trust you guys to make good decisions. That's why I stay up at night worrying in the middle of the night. And I think until the day she died, she stayed up worrying late at night for her children and grandchildren and for the things that were taking place in the world. And I think for a lot of us, that's the same thing that happens, is that we lose sleep, lose nights worrying over the things that we cannot control. My grandma couldn't control us. That was why she worried. And when we worry, we feel like we have some control over the situation. We feel like we can control what's happening in our lives, even if we have zero control over what's happening in our lives, because there's gonna be things in our lives that we don't have control over, that just kind of happen to us, and our choice is to figure out about whether or not we want to worry about them. And most of the time we end up dwelling on those things. We spend most of the time in what I like to call the magical thinking spin, that just spins and spins and spins, and if our brain just spins enough, that it will solve whatever's going on, and lots of times it just keeps us up in the middle of the night. But that is one of the things that I love about the Psalms, because every psalm that is what we call a lament psalm, one where the writer is crying out to God. And most of our psalms are lament psalms. Except for Psalm 88, it's the only one that doesn't end this way. Most of them end with this praise of God. Knowing that God is in control, knowing that God is going to work it out, knowing that God is going to figure it out. In the psalm that we read this morning, the psalm writer is David, and his enemies are coming close to him. And yet, in a situation where he didn't have much control over his enemies coming close to him, he said, "But I trust you, God. I know that you're with me. I know that you are sustaining me. I know that you are with me." The narrative changed from worry and scaredness and fear into worship. But I know that that's easier said than done. It's so easy to just be like, turn your worry into worship. That's why that story about my grandma makes so much sense, because she could have just turned her worry into worship. But our brains don't always work that way. Our hearts don't always work that way. We trust God, but sometimes our problems seem too big. During our recent government shutdown, I heard a continual story after story of people who were lacking trust in the things that were around them. They weren't trusting that the government could figure it out. Understandably so. But they were trusting that they couldn't trust that the government had their back, that the people in power above them could figure out the compromise and get out of the crisis. And many of the stories that I heard of people who were on furlough were stories of people who felt out of control because they didn't know when they would get their jobs back again. They didn't know when they would start working again. They were despondent and despair because the government entities who had said, "We will take care of you," stopped taking care of 800,000 people. So there was a lot of fear and anxiety and worry. The fear and anxiety and worry was valid. When we feel those things, they're valid fears. The Bible passage this morning reminds us that we have nothing to fear, nothing to worry about, because God is with us, protecting us from harm, and that we are guided and protected by God. So how do we live a life without worry and fear? How do we live this life of faith where we know deep down in our hearts that God is protecting us, that God is working it out, that God is figuring it out? How do we, in the darkest nights of our soul, because we all have them, trust that God is with us and that God brings people and situations around us to protect us? How do we trust that? In the 3rd grade, my Sunday school class read this book called The Hiding Place, and I've read it probably 3 or 4 times since then. It's one of my favorite books. It's by this woman named Corrie ten Boom. And it's called The Hiding Place because she and her family, the ten Boom family, her sister Betsy and her father Otto, they hid people during World War II. They had a special hiding place for people, for the Jews, and they had special papers for them and all sorts of things. And they, once a week at least, would have practice drills. And the practice drills that they would have would practice, they would wake them up in the middle of the night, startle them in the middle of the night. Someone on their team of people that was helping them hide these Jews would come and wake them up in the middle of the night, flashlights in their face, and say, "Where are the people that you are hiding?" And they were taught that they were to lie and say, "We're not hiding any people, we don't know what you're talking about." And in the book, the way Corrie ten Boom talks about it, she said the first few times it was so hard when you're startled awake to not tell the truth because you've been startled awake. But she said after a while we learned to not tell the truth. But her sister Betsy, who had this deep and profound faith, was like, "I have a problem with this. I can't lie. I can't lie because it's one of the Big Ten. It's one of the 10 Commandments. It says, don't lie. So I don't know what I'm going to do when the Gestapo comes. I don't know what I'm going to do when something bad happens." And so both Corrie and her father Otto were just despondent, worried about what would happen if the Gestapo came. So one morning, all of them were sitting around the kitchen table. So Corrie and Betsy and Otto, and then the 5 or 6 people that they were hiding. When all of a sudden, their nephew came in and said, "The Gestapo are coming, you have to hide them now." Well, the problem was there was one gentleman who had a asthmatic breathing problem. He was quite old. And so getting up to the hiding place was quite an endeavor. And the Gestapo were coming in 2 minutes, not the 5 to 7 minutes that it took them to hide them in the hiding place. So they're like, "What are we going to do? What are we going to do? What are we going to do?" When all of a sudden one of them remembered that they had a cellar, like a fruit cellar, underneath their kitchen table. So they hid them all in the fruit cellar, under the fruit and vegetable cellar underneath the kitchen table. And the SS come in, and when they came in, they first asked Corrie, they're like, "Where are the people that you're hiding?" And she's like, I don't know what you're talking about. No, we're not hiding anyone. And they asked Otto, and they asked the other people. I think there were other people at lunch that day. They were like, "I don't know." When all of a sudden Betsy blurts out, "They're under the table!" And they all freeze. And the SS pull the tablecloth off the table, and they don't see the cellar. They don't see the cellar that's under the table, because what they thought when they heard there's someone under the table, they thought they would see 6 people sitting underneath the table rather than a cellar. And the SS got angry and marched off and left. And I love that story because Betsy says later on to her sister, she's like, "Why didn't you just lie like the rest of us? Why didn't you just not tell the truth?" And she said, "I trusted that God would be with us. I trusted that God would protect us and that following what God would want for me, God would protect us." And God did for a long time. God protected those Jews that they were hiding for a very long time. And I think, and Corrie ten Boom shares very adamantly that she still thinks her sister was crazy. Even when she wrote this story, she was like, "My sister should have just lied. I'm grateful that God protected us, but my sister should have just lied." And because most of us would have lied, myself included, I would have lied too, and I don't like lying. But what if we lived that life that Betsy lived, that life not without fear, but without worry, knowing that God is in control. Because when we stop worrying, we stop having control over our lives. And that's the hardest thing for most of us to do. Because when we hold on to our worry and our fear, when we hold on to that fear, we feel like we're holding on to something in our lives. But what if we reframed the question? What if instead of holding on to that worry and fear, we let it go and we trusted God? What if we reframed the narrative from worry and fear to hope and trust? Now, I shared with you that I come from a long history of champion worriers, and I am also a champion worrier. I have spent many nights awake worrying about things I had no control over. And it usually happens at 3 a.m. 3 a.m. is the time that no one should be awake because that's when the spin happens. That's when the worry happens. But I made a decision about 5 or 6 years ago after I had a long, probably 6-month bout of really terrible insomnia and really terrible worry about a bunch of stuff. And I decided that I was going to change the narrative. That when I woke up in the middle of the night, when the spin started happening, that instead of me trying to count sheep, instead of me trying to just be quiet and meditate, because quiet meditation just made my brain spin more and more and more and more, that I was going to do what's called a breath prayer. I was going to say words of scripture that had been written upon my heart and that reminded me to not fear and worry. And though that breath prayer for me is from Psalm 46:10, it is, "Be still and know that I am God." And I repeat it over and over again. Now, it doesn't always work. It is not magical. I wish it was. Friday night, when I was worried about this conference that I was in charge of, the 501 conference that I was in charge of, and I wasn't sleeping, and the breath prayer wasn't working, I really wished that that they were magical words. But what it does is it reframes my heart and my thoughts about the worry and the fear and the anxiety in my life. It reframes that worry, knowing that I can be still, that my heart can be still, the noise in my head can be still, and that my body can be still, knowing that God is God and that God is with me. It allows me to reframe the control that I'm trying to hold on to and lets it go and gives it to God. So what if instead of holding on to our worries, we turned them into acts of worship? What if instead of holding on to our worries like these prized possessions that we can control in our lives, what if we gave them to God instead of lying awake at night? Our theme verse for this passage comes from Philippians 4, and I really want to focus just on that last, on verses 6 and 7 of Philippians 4. And it says this, it says, "Do not worry about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, which guards your hearts and your minds in Jesus Christ." Turn our worries to worship. Turn our fears into hope. God has the capacity to do that. FDR said that there was nothing to fear but fear itself. Because if we live in fear, if we live in worry, then that becomes who we are. But if we reframe our worry, if we reframe our fear and say, God, I acknowledge that this is something that is out of control in my life. I acknowledge that this is something I don't see the answer to. But I also acknowledge that you are with me, that you are guiding my steps, you are guiding my hand. What if we flipped the narrative from worry to worship? Let us pray.